You know, let me transition in this presentation to talking a little bit about mobilizing to do something about these issues. We got questions yesterday from folks like Denise, you know, well, why aren't we doing more? Why aren't we getting together and actually moving this agenda forward? So let me address that in what we're doing, we're trying to do, what our ambition is to do in the Library Publishing Coalition that you've heard us mentioning over the past couple days. Let me acknowledge the help of Sarah Lippincott, who developed many of these slides. You'll see a lot of overlap between the slides that I and Julie are going to use because they all came from Sarah. Let me give you, you know, I was talking to Spencer and, you know, remarking on how, who was remarking about the metaphors that we hear about being deluged and flooded by information and the problems and so forth. And the need for, you know, coming up with alternative metaphors for these things. So I'll offer you a few different metaphors in this talk as ways of understanding our situation and our motivation for trying to move forward. Let me give you, as a starting point, a couple of narratives to, you know, simplify the conversation and talk about it and talk about our motivations in forming the LPC. Then I'll give you a quick project formation timeline and bring us up to speed with where we are now, and then turn it over to Julie, who will talk about what our plans are for going forward. So this is a vastly oversimplified narrative of the changes in the scholarly communication cycle over the last 6 decades. And this is a summary of the story that you're all familiar with. We've read about it, we've lived it, of how the cycle has changed over time and some of the problems that have interjected themselves into it. And I am informed by this by many studies that have been done by the Mellon Foundation and other groups of how the dynamic of scholarly communication has changed. Well, you know, so once upon a time, say pre-1950, the system was a bit simpler. Academia as an endeavor was a bit smaller. We had fewer students in the system, fewer faculty, fewer disciplines. And it was more of or at least perceived, understood as a more tightly knit system between at least these 3 actors in academia. The faculty who submitted manuscripts to the presses then published things that went to the libraries for long-term maintenance and then which informed the faculty in their research. The only thing I'm trying to draw out with this picture is that all of these actors were, you know, relatively you know, constrained, managed, understood by the administrative policies and management practices of the academy. Of course, there are also in the picture funders, whether federal funders, you know, other agencies, state agencies that in some cases, you know, have close linkages with academia. NSF officers are often academics that go to serve you know, tours of duty in NSF and then come back to academia and so forth. But, you know, again, there is a tight a dialogue, a means of negotiating and controlling costs between these entities. Okay, so the changes that many of these Mellon studies and other groups tracked over the years is, well, as academia got bigger, as more students came into the system, especially post-World War II, you know, the field exploded, and we had the Cold War that expanded the funding from federal sources to drive all this. We had a great proliferation of scientific disciplines, and as we heard from our keynote speaker, you know, a big part of what drives the academic careers is, of course, the need to get published in key peer-reviewed, prestigious publications, whether in the humanities, the monographs, or in scientific literature. In journals, but basically the literature proliferated, and at the same time faculty responsibilities were getting more and more, you know, extended. They were doing other things. They were being called upon to do all sorts of other stuff. And also universities were decreasing the funding to their presses and their degree of subsidization that they were willing to subsidize presses with. All of those put a lot of pressure on faculty and this sort of closed community, to use another metaphor, this ecology of actors in ways that put stress on the system, exhausted their resources, and so forth. Okay, so in an ecology, to extend my metaphor, What happens when you have a population of critters that are under a lot of stress and becoming weaker? Well, do other animals show up that are going to help them all the time? Probably not. So, we ended up with, and I like this metaphor that Jeffrey Beal introduced to us of predatory publishers, and I do exempt many external commercial publishers like Sage from this moniker. I think there are groups that are much more friendly and much more reasonable to academia than others, and many of you will recognize the somewhat sublimely menacing Dutch corporate logo in the Predator set over there. That arose to help in this situation, to help in the way of offering editorial services for faculty members and manage, outsource, if you will, a lot of that scholarly communication cycle, which then started going around university presses and over to these external, notably foreign, overseas operations. Well, of course, we know the story, how that came back to haunt us, and how the, to extend some of these ecological metaphors, to the sanguinary ones that we also hear about, and we started hemorrhaging funds, and bleeding out on all the funding patterns that then were in place. Well, so concretely, what does that mean? So those of you who are library administrators are very familiar with this. We've lived it. I mean, I've experienced this my whole career for decades. The cost of scientific and scholarly serials that are controlled largely by a lot of these overseas monopolies have increased annually by at least 8%, and in many years far more than that. And it's documented, in lots of places. The most proximate every year is the annual periodicals price survey published by Library Journal. For perspective, concrete, real world, on a roughly $6 million serials budget like we have, just keeping the same base of serials every year costs another almost $500,000. Well, what also changed in this picture is the forces of cost management that I alluded to, of academic leadership, have stepped in, and our budgets are flat, because of the escalation in academic budgets. They have stepped in and largely made budgets flattened. So that means, that $480,000 extra bucks a year isn't there. So what does that mean? Well, if the budgets don't go up, that means $480,000 gets canceled every year. And we see this, very destructive cycle of cancellation that we've seen in library after library all around the country over the past decade or more. We cannot, our coping mechanisms have run out. Cutting costs in other areas isn't working anymore. So there is a big fire lit under us as academic leadership right now. We've got to break ourselves out of this cycle somehow. So what's the alternative? Well, there are lots of alternatives being proposed. The research from Tyler and Spark and lots of other advocacy groups that have described, many ways of these, the key academic actors, faculty, university presses, and libraries, directly re-engaging and taking back control management of the scholarly communication cost structures, and perhaps in large groups for leverage, and not simply reacting to these external dynamics passively. You've heard about, the good alternatives. They basically, amount to different kinds of innovations and partnerships between these actor groups. And these permutations, I would argue, also amount in some ways to some strategy for reintegrating this scholarly communication cycle within, to use that metaphor again, an academic space that is protected from predatory practices, that is managed in a way that we can control the cost in an effective way. Well, is that easy? No. As Tyler said, we all feel this feeling. It's easy to say, well, wait, we're, and insert your own label, faculty, librarians, publishers. We've never done that before. We don't know how. We aren't equipped to do that. That's not our received mission. We're not funded to do that, all the things that Tyler just said. There are reasons, though, to believe that we can reintegrate the scholarly communication cycle, as Tyler said. These are some of the things that he mentioned and other things that I'll note. Obviously the growing acceptance and recognition of the open access movement, the context that this Symposium series is within, and of course the work of Spark. The fact that in many cases university libraries and presses are actually organizationally combined in many cases now. The widespread examples that Tyler cited and you all know about of successful projects in which libraries work with scholars to directly host the publication of specialized research journals. Other models like the archive now at Cornell. A growing conviction among academic leaders that, well, okay, the scholarly communication cycle may be broken, but we surely can and have to try to fix the darn thing. Okay, so why a library publishing coalition? Why now? Okay, well, we've had lots of good forums for discussion about library topics, lots of library conferences, lots of publishing conferences, and even very good digital library topic conferences. We felt in conversations that there was no clearly situated venue for discussion and advancement of the intersection of all three of those topics and this reintegration of the scholarly communication cycle. And that's my phrasing, that's my metaphor. Don't understand that to be the narrative of the LPC. That's just the way I articulate it. That need is seen by the library leaders involved in these discussions for a new focus on those topics. And I will mark that these topics are not new, it's just we need to really get off the dime and engage with them. I remember at the very first CNI meeting, there were discussions about a lot of these same ideas that were floating around then. It's just, you know, we've made some real progress in understanding these issues and real models now. We can get new traction. This discussion bridges a lot of the different groups, many of the groups that are represented in this conference, faculty members, publishers, librarians. The coalition was instigated by library leaders, probably I would say because we have a greater sense of urgency and, you know, we're writing the checks on all these huge cost increases and attention to that long-term issue of sustaining the scholarly communication cycle. Okay. So the discussions ultimately, you know, should lead to mobilization here. So I'll interject another, you know, revolutionary sort of metaphor here. So a small doughty band of library leaders got together and dared to talk to each other about this topic about a year ago. We quickly learned that we were in violent agreement with one another, and we decided we actually wanted to do something about it. And it sort of went viral from there, to use yet another strange ecological metaphor. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, okay, here's a brief recap timeline. And it has been a very short narrative of the timeline of this startup. We started talking about this between Virginia Tech, Purdue, and University of North Texas about a year ago. We very quickly realized, yeah, we really wanted to do something on this. We drafted a précis, circulated it among different groups for feedback, then proceeded over the summer to you know, issue a call for participation, you know, who's interested in this thing, to, you know, that many of you probably saw circulating around the net. We got a project team together in September of last year, and we quickly, you know, came up with some, you know, a basic workable, you know, idea of, okay, this is what people can fund, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, you know, to get this thing off the ground. In October, we had a very large phone teleconference that those of you who were on it will remember the sea of voices that, you know, talking on that thing and reporting in. It was quite the event. And then established some structure to the group and that has moved it forward since. Project background, again, it's sort of, we have identified a project, realized this coalition is not done. We didn't think we were going to get this thing done day one. What we wanted was to create a project to create the coalition. So we kicked it off in January of this year. We're going to wrap it up, we hope, next year, end of next year. And the aim is to create this coalition, to understand what it's about, to study, document it, and so forth, and how to structure this community-led initiative in order to promote all the good collaboration and knowledge sharing that you heard about from Tyler. And it was, of course, informed by these different studies. There were quite a number of different studies that IMLS has funded, Tyler's research, other things that were invoked in the discussions of this thing. We did, you know, we didn't want to wait for, one of the discussions we had is, well, do we wait till we can get an IMLS grant or something, or seed funding? We didn't want to wait for that. This was important enough to the library leadership involved in these things that we were willing to put some skin in the game to get this thing going. Okay, our project team. We don't have a Washington figure, you know, it would be nice if we did, but at least I can say that a lot of us are rowing in the same direction on this thing. The founding institutions are kicking in $5K per year for 2 years, and they're sort of the drivers, the engines of this project. We do have also a role for other institutions that aren't too sure how much they want to get involved, or if they just want to play an advisory role. It's $1K per year for that 2-year period, and many of those are advisors to the project. And of course, our host institution, we needed some apparatus to organize things, to make payments, to mobilize efforts, to be able to employ a project manager, Sarah Lippincott again, and that is the Educopia Institute. So that's our boat that's sort of carrying us forward, keeping us afloat, if you will, and providing the glue and infrastructure for this endeavor. Okay, so 3 distinct groups that are sort of managing the process. We've got an executive group that does a lot of the go-to work involved here, the organizing committee, largely deans, that, you know, kind of provide the overall oversight, ideas, and, you know, sign the checks. Then the advisory committee that is providing broad perspective and feedback to the organizing committee. And we have mechanisms in place for nominating people and structuring this. Again, this is a project, and let me distinguish the notion of and the transitional arc that we are envisioning between the current project and the ultimate coalition. The project so far is 55 institutions that have signed up in these various levels to produce these concrete deliverables. It's a 2-year bounded endeavor, and it's a founding process, an explicit process of understanding an organizational structure, developing a set of shared aims and whatnot. What will the coalition be like? We don't know that yet. You know, that is what very much we're going to spend this 2 years figuring out, you know, using all the wealth of good best practices that have existed for a while, and trying to model what the different roles and services and so forth, and what our actual collaborative, you know, put the meat on the bones, so that, as Tyler said, of the you know, what those collaborative structures, activities are going to look like, and what that ongoing endeavor will be like. Okay, our aims and ambitions are to encourage the mainstreaming of library publishing in a range of forms, establish those effective channels and networks with different groups. And I think it's important to understand how we envision this as a bridging activity that will ultimately improve the scholarly communication ecosystem and provide services to the practitioners. Okay, so to wrap up my part of it, our mission statement that we ultimately sort of was the last part of the beginning that we developed is, I think, a straightforward mission statement. The Library Publishing Coalition promotes the development of innovative, sustainable publishing services in academic and research libraries to support scholars as they create, advance, and disseminate knowledge. And as to what we think that's going to mean, let me turn it over to Julie.